major point in intercultural relations. The Umar Pact or Umar agreement or letter to the people of Jerusalem. It was not mentioned in Umar's letter to the people of Jerusalem.
That's a good point.
I think
that's very important, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There are a lot of studies on this in Dundee, UK, Scotland. It's called Al-Maktoum Center for Islamic Studies.
Okay.
مركز المكتوم للدراسات الإسلامية.
Maktoum. Okay.
I can send you further details. They have Islamic Jerusalem studies. They give BA and MA and PhD degrees. They're interested in this. ما شاء الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. نرحب بكم في هذه الأمسية لنقدم محاضرا كريما من كندا، هو البروفيسور باتريس برودور، وهو أستاذ مشارك ورئيس قسم دراسة الإسلام والتعددية والعولمة في كلية الإلهيات أو العقيدة والعلوم الدين في جامعة مونتريال. والبروفيسور برودور أيضا أصبح عميد الحياة الدينية والروحية بجامعة مونتريال أيضا، وقد حصل على البكالوريوس في الدراسات الدينية والماجستير أيضا من معهد الدراسات الدينية، معهد الدراسات الإسلامية بجامعة ماجيل، وهو من المعاهد المشهورة في الغرب لدراسة الإسلام ومن أقدمها. وحصل على الماجستير أيضا مرة أخرى والدكتوراه من جامعة هارفارد في الدراسات الدينية، وله العديد من المشاركات العلمية. وسيحدثنا هذه الليلة عن التعددية الثقافية والعلاقات الثقافية والتعددية عموما في كندا والشرق الأوسط. فنرجو أن يتفضل، وسأقوم بترجمة موجزة لفقرات المحاضرة، وليس ترجمة دقيقة أو حرفية أو لكل ما يقال. Please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My presentation tonight is a summary of some of my thoughts, some of my own personal thoughts on the question of multiculturalism and interculturalism, both in terms of Middle Eastern history as well as in terms of Canadian history. This, of course, in a few minutes that we have tonight will be short and will be a brief overview. And so hopefully in the question and answer period, we will be able to dig in deeper a little bit in the areas that you may want me to go further into. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I would like to begin by saying that I will talk a little bit about pluralism in the Middle East or North Asia and North Africa and West Asia. I will give a few statistic overview and trends in Canada. Some of you may already know this information, but if you don't know that much about Canada, I thought that it would be useful to give at least a little bit of basic information. Before then really talking about the evolution of multiculturalism and interculturalism in Canada. Before then raising a few questions around the challenges for a more pluralistic future, both in Canada, in the Middle East, and beyond. So let me begin tonight by briefly going back historically to a few examples of what I call sort of open messages of pluralism. And one of the message is a recent one, the Amman message, that has tried to respond sort of and present to the world an understanding of Islam which is rooted in what Westerners sometimes call moderate Islam. But I think what many people would talk about as al-Islam al-Mustawa, I mean the middle ground Islam, that is really where a lot of majority of Muslims stand in terms of their interpretation of Islam. But this message actually has an old history in some ways. When we look at the history, we can go back to a variety of periods, which I will get to in a moment. And the second element of an even more recent past, in fact, just last 2 months ago, is a letter of 138 Muslim leaders, and it was a historic event because it actually brought together both Sunnis and Shiites and a variety of Shiite leaders together. And that particular letter was a response to the fact that a year prior to that, the 38 Muslim leaders had sent a letter to Pope Benedict XVI in order to try to rethink the way in which he had described Islam in his speech at Regensburg University in September of 2006. And so, not having had a response from the Pope directly or even indirectly, a year later the process expanded to 138 leaders, and sending a letter not only to the Pope, the leader of the Catholics, Christian, but also to 40-some Christian religious leaders. And so this event also, I think, indicates a vitality of what I would describe as a pluralist nature in the Muslim world today. These are positive, constructive examples of that pluralism within the world of Islam today. I begin here because this letter begins by saying that Muslims and Christians together make up well over half of the world's population. Without peace and justice between these two religious communities, there can be no meaningful peace in the world. The future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christians. And the summary of that letter ends with, thus, in obedience to the Holy Quran, we as Muslims invite Christians to come together with us on the basis of what is common to us, which is also what is most essential to our faith and practice, the two commandments of love, which is love of God and love of our neighbors. This is an example, again, of what I call putting the emphasis on commonalities between Christians and Muslims as a response, in fact, to a time today when we know that there is a tension between the West and the Islamic world, that there is often a feeling of misunderstanding, of Islamophobia on the one hand, and often of misunderstanding or stereotypes about the West and about America in particular. And these tensions, I think, need to be addressed in non-belligerent ways, and these are very powerful examples, in fact, coming from the initiatives of Muslims that are taking place internationally today, and that bring up the importance of religious leadership in what I call international politics today. Yes.
هذه المحاضرة هي مجمل للأفكار التي تدور في ذهني حول العلاقات بين الثقافات والتفاعل بين الثقافات في التاريخ الإسلامي وفي العصر الحديث في الشرق الأوسط وكندا. وتحدث عن أيضا ظهور التعددية الثقافية والتفاعل الثقافي في كندا. ثم يقول المحاضرة ستتناول أمثلة تاريخية ومن النماذج القريبة الرسالة المفتوحة لرسالة عمان، وهي تعبر عن الإسلام الوسطي أو الإسلام الذي يعتقده معظم المسلمين، كما سيتناول التعددية الثقافية في مراحلها التاريخية وفي العصر الحديث. وذكر أن هناك رسالة بعثها 138 عالم زعيم مسلم أو قائد إسلامي جمعت بين السنة والشيعة، وكانت استجابة أو رد فعل للخطاب البابا بنديكت الذي تناول الإسلام بنقد معين في الجامعة الألمانية. ورغم مرور مدة على هذه الرسالة لم يستجب البابا. ثم بعد سنة قام هؤلاء العلماء بإرسال رسالة إلى 40 زعيم ديني نصراني، وهذه من أمثلة التعددية في العالم الإسلامي. وتبدأ الرسالة بالقول إن المسلمين والنصارى يكونون أو يؤلفون أكثر من نصف سكان العالم، فكيف يمكن أن يتحقق السلام في العالم إذا لم يكن هناك اتفاق بين المسلمين والنصارى. وذكر الخطاب أن المسلمين أو أن الإسلام يدعو إلى التفاهم مع النصارى، وهو يشير إلى الآية الكريمة التي تقول: قل يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم والبحث عن المشترك بين المسلمين والنصارى، ولإزالة ما هو موجود في الغرب من الخوف من الإسلام، المرض الجديد هذا الإسلاموفوبيا، وأيضا لإزالة الصورة أو تحسين الصورة السلبية للغرب للغرب لدى المسلمين. وذكر في النهاية أن المبادرة بدأت من المسلمين، أن المسلمين هم الذين بادروا إلى مثل هذا.
And so here you see, of course, a variety of religious worldviews in terms of percentage. Indeed, Muslims and Christians being more than half of the world's population today. These statistics we need to take with one grain of salt at least, but at least it gives a proportional idea. But it also includes, what I like about this picture is that it includes also the last two categories at the bottom, non-religious and atheist, that together represent only about 14% of the world's population. And yet, in terms of the link of those particular worldviews to the ways in which the West has developed, and especially the scientific discourse, sometimes that 14% has more weight internationally than some of the other worldviews. But we can come back on this later if need be. Let me now go back historically, therefore, to the period of the Prophet Muhammad, when the concept of the Ummah was developed, predominantly with the constitution or the Wathiq Medina, the constitution or the covenant of Medina, which was a social contract whereby one community was created of diverse tribes living under the sovereignty of God. And so, to me, it is an example, a brilliant example of pluralism in action. The concept may not have been there at that time, but the practice was there. And it brought together and it ended intertribal conflicts, and it brought together a variety of original groups to the then called city of Yathrib, which soon thereafter became the city of Al-Medina. And the list is here, as well as, of course, the new immigrant group, the Muhajirun, the Muslims from Mecca as such. And why is it a reflection of pluralism? Because it is an inclusive social contract for everybody that lived there. So it was a contract that allowed for some unity of the community, recognizing diversity of some identities in terms of ethnicity, of tribe, and even to some degree religious worldviews. So that's why I think that we can look at the example of that constitution as a form of integrated pluralism, a unity in diversity. Our arrangement is that when I finish one slide, there's translation.
أشار إلى الرسم البياني الظاهر أمامكم، وهو رسم بياني أعد عام 2005 حول الأديان في العالم، أتباع الأديان، وذكر نسبة المسلمين والنصارى، وأشار إلى الذين لا يعتقدون بأي دين أو يرفضون الأديان، والذين والملحدين. فيقول أن نسبة هؤلاء بلغت 14%، ولكن يقول من غرائب هذا الزمن أن 14% هؤلاء قد يكون لهم تأثير أكثر من غيرهم، وسيعود إلى هذا الموضوع فيما بعد. كما أشار إلى ظهور مفهوم الأمة في الصحيفة أو الكتاب الذي كتبه الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم بين أطراف سكان المدينة من مهاجرين وأنصار ومن كان على غير الإسلام، ولم يشر إلى وأيضا اليهود، ويقال أن هذه الصحيفة أنهت الصراعات بين الفرق المختلفة، وهي عقد سمح بوجود وحدة بين سكان المدينة، وكذلك من الناحية الدينية، وهو مثال للتعددية والوحدة والتنوع.
And so, of course, some of you may already know that the aims of the Constitution of Medina included several factors. I'm going to list them there quickly. And the reason is because they actually resonate with some of the needs that we find in our societies today as well. So security, religious freedoms, the notion that is not yet on a broader level, but the creation in Medina of a haram, or a sacred place, which I would argue would be necessary to create in other places also. For example, I can see the thought of creating in the old city of Jerusalem the concept of haram as a sacred place without any kind of violence, and a zone of peace, so that all worshippers can pray in their sacred sites within the old city walls. And so that's an idea which I think we can translate and bring forth as part of the heritage of Islam to, that could serve also the Muslims and non-Muslims in the old city of Jerusalem. There is notions of security of women already at that time. There was notion of stable tribal relations within the diversity of tribal differences at that time. There was notion of a tax system for supporting the community in times of conflict. Of course, notions which are just further developed today. But one can actually see, by actually looking at all of the content of this particular covenant, that in many ways it was forward-looking, but also that these are some of the elements in a social contract, whether it happens at a small scale as the city of Medina, or whether it happens at a national level, or whether it happens internationally.
ذكر أن من أهداف صحيفة المدينة وأنها ترتبط بما نحتاجه اليوم، وهناك عدة نقاط في هذه الصحيفة، منها الأمن والطمأنينة والعلاقات بين مختلف السكان، تحديد حدود الحرم، وأشار إلى أن هذه قضية يعني جميلة لو طبقت في عصرنا الحاضر أو تطبق حتى في منطقة في القدس، وأن هذه منطقة الحرم منطقة أمن وسلام، منطقة يمنع فيها الصيد، يمنع فيها القتل، يمنع فيها أشياء كثيرة يمكن أن نستفيد منها في هذا الزمن. وذكر أن هذه الوثيقة أيضا أو هذه الصحيفة أشارت إلى أمن النساء والعلاقات بين القبائل ومسألة الدفاع عن المدينة، وهي وإن كانت يعني صحيفة أو دستور أو وثيقة لمدينة واحدة صغيرة، لكن يمكن تطبيقها على مستوى أوسع من ذلك بكثير.
So when we think about pluralism or ideas of pluralism then and now, even though the concept itself of ta'adudiyya in Arabic is recent, the practice in many ways is old. And so we look at first the concept of the ummah, which was all-inclusive in the first years in Medina. But we can also look at the concept of the good governance, which was at the center of the letter which the fourth caliph, Khalifa Ali ibn Abi Talib, wrote when he wrote to Malik al-Ashtar, who had just been nominated to become the governor of Egypt in what is 656 in the Common Era. And the way in which that particular letter provides a long series of recommendations on what good governance means in those days. And it's fascinating to see that the United Nations report on the state of development in the Arab world in 2002 used 6 passages from that particular letter. And I think it again creates a sense that notions of good governance and the theory in this case of good governance was in fact very much part of one very important religious leader in the early history of Islam. And all of these concepts of hukuma and wilaya and amr and mulk and etc. were concepts, rich concepts around governance that today are being re-examined in order to think about an Islamic political philosophy that can be adapted for the needs of the day. The other examples in Islamic history, very briefly, of course, are the Umayyad period in Andalusia, especially the reigns of the 3 Abd al-Rahman. One can look also at the early Abbasid period and the Ottomans. I have another one, that's fine. Of the early Ottomans, or some of the Ottoman period. And now, again, one can trace a lineage of some of those pluralist approaches into the Imam message, the open letter. But even I would argue in the recent efforts here in Saudi Arabia of promoting a national dialogue, and trying sort of to develop, in a way, a practice of some dimensions of pluralist approach, of reaching out to a variety of all the different areas within the kingdom, as well as different sectors of society, and addressing different issues over the years. And so I think that these are examples of pluralist practice of a different kinds, but that does say again that this notion has already some dimension of existence within Islamic history then and now.
بعد الحديث عن صحيفة المدينة ذكر أن علي بن أبي طالب رضي الله عنه أرسل رسالة إلى مالك بن الأشتر واليه على مصر، والتي لم تصل، أظن قتل حامل الرسالة، ولكن فيها توصيات رائعة للحكم الرشيد. والأمم المتحدة في تقريرها عن التنمية البشرية والتنمية الإنسانية للعالم العربي استخدمت 6 نقاط من تلك الرسالة، والرسالة تحمل مفاهيم كثيرة عن الحكومة والولاية والملك، ومفاهيم ثرية ويتم العودة إليها اليوم. كما أشار إلى الحكم الأموي في الأندلس وبعض فترات الحكم العثماني وظهور التعددية فيها، وأشار أخيرا إلى التعددية أو محاولة التعددية في المملكة العربية السعودية في موضوع الحوار الوطني الذي تناول مجموعة من القضايا والمجالات التي تؤكد على مسألة التعددية.
So let's now move to Canada and look at Canada as, of course, the second largest country in the world, with a very low density in population. In that sense, similar to Saudi Arabia, that has a large amount of space with a relatively small population. And we are now 32 million people in Canada, so a little more than here in Saudi Arabia. And we have, since 1990, a steady income, or inflow, rather, of 225,000 immigrants from around the world, and which, of course, is based on an old immigration tradition within Canada. But initially, the immigration in the previous decades of the 20th century, as well as in the 19th century, were predominantly from European background. And we find that the immigration is primarily for economic reasons, as well as for family reunification. And this immigration inflow is in part because the natural demographic growth, the birth rate, in other words, in Canada, is actually not very high. And so because of that, there's a slowing pace of the growth in natural population, and therefore an aging population. And the need is to therefore bring in a younger population to sustain population growth, and for economic development to continue, and also to sustain some of the social benefits of an aging population. There's a last trend, or next to last trend, is increased urbanization, especially around those 3 major cities of Toronto, the largest city in Canada, Montreal, the second one, and Vancouver. But the population is relatively concentrated into the center of the country, i.e. in the 2 provinces of Ontario and Quebec, where there's about 60% of the total population.
ننتقل الآن إلى كندا، ويقول أن كندا لديها كثافة منخفضة في السكان ومساحة واسعة، وتشبه في ذلك المملكة العربية السعودية. وعدد سكان كندا يبلغ 32 مليون، أكثر قليلا من السعودية. ومنذ 1990 وهناك هجرات متواصلة، يبلغ عدد المهاجرين 25 ألف مهاجر سنوي. 250 ألف 225 أوكي 225 ألف مهاجر سنوي، وهو تقليد قديم. وفي القرن الماضي كان معظم المهاجرين من أوروبا، وكان ذلك لأسباب اقتصادية أو تجمع عائلي، أفراد عائلة واحدة أو العائلات تتجمع. وهذه الهجرات أيضا سببها أن النمو السكاني منخفض، والنمو السكاني الطبيعي الذي يساعد على الازدهار والاستفادة من الثروات قليل، فلإبقاء هذا النمو كان لابد من فتح المجال للهجرة، وأيضا أن المجتمعات الغربية كندا أو غيرها تواجه ازدياد نسبة كبار السن. وذكر أن سكان كندا يتركزون في مناطق ثلاث محدودة، ويصل هذا التركيز إلى 60%.
So just a little reminder for those of you who may not have the map of Canada freshly in your mind. And just a reminder that the population of Canada, 90% of the population, in fact, is in the southern bottom, within 100 miles of the United States. So the rest is pretty, as some would say, empty. Others would say, no, there are the presence of many different smaller groups, especially indigenous communities. And therefore, there's a richness also in population, although small in number, in further areas away from the United States.
قل 90% من سكان كندا يتركزون في الجزء الجنوبي المجاور للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، والكثير من الناس يقولون أن بقية المناطق فارغة، ولكن الحقيقة أنها ثرية بوجود السكان الأصليين الذين يقطنون بعيدا عن الحدود مع الولايات المتحدة.
Language is probably the most important identity marker in terms of Canadian politics. If you're in the United States, it tends to be race. In Canada, the equivalent would be language. And here you have differences over 50 years on the left in terms of Canada. The English population remains as the mother tongue, as the spoken, is about 60% of Canada only has a mother tongue of English. And the blue is the French, which decreases over 50 years in comparison to the black part, which is other languages than English or French. And that is due, of course, to the steady increase in immigrants from a variety of different countries around the world. Interestingly enough, many of the Quebecers feel that that decrease in the French concentration overall in Canada is a source of worry, is a source of fear that the French language and the French culture potentially could disappear in the long term. And if we look at the figures on the Quebec side, which is only within one province, you notice that the question would be, well, why do we have to fear, since there is more or less 80% of French in Quebec, which remains steady over the same 50 years, right? But the reality is that the reasons why in 2001 the figures of 80% remain more or less the same is because in 1976, a government, a pro-independence government, came into power and voted the Bill 101, which required from that time onwards all immigrants whose parents were not English speaking, in a nutshell, that they had to send their kids to French schools and not to English schools. So by 25 years later, you have the results that you did indeed keep the same amount of French spoken predominantly as a mother tongue and as certainly a language of work. But it's the English, the green in this case, on the right-hand side, the green which decreases. So it's the Anglophone population, relatively speaking, in Quebec, which decreases at the expense of the allophones. And what's interesting today is that the third most important language spoken in Quebec is Arabic.
يقول اللغة من أهم عناصر الهوية في كندا في السياسات الكندية، فإذا كان في أمريكا المشكلة الأساسية العرق، ففي كندا اللغة هي المحددة للهوية أو من أهم عناصر تحديد الهوية. وذكر أن اللغة الإنجليزية يتحدثها 60%، لغتهم الأم هي الإنجليزية، وأن اللغة الفرنسية تنخفض، وسبب ذلك أن الزيادة مستمرة في الهجرة، وأن كثير من سكان كوبيك الفرنسية الذين يتحدثون الفرنسية قلقون من انخفاض المتحدثين بهذه اللغة. وهناك تساؤل لماذا القلق مع أن 80% من سكان كوبيك يتكلمون الفرنسية، وأنه في سنة ذكرها 1967
يعني 67
1976 صدر قرار حكومي يفرض على كل المهاجرين الجدد أعتقد في منطقة كوبيك أن يرسلوا أبنائهم لتعلم الفرنسية، فليس هناك قلق، ولكن هناك مع موجات المهاجرين جاءت لغة جديدة ثالثة لتنافس اللغتين الأساسية وهي اللغة العربية.
Now, in Canada, we think that there are two official languages, but if you look at what is the percentage of the population that is bilingual, we may have a surprise. In Quebec, it's a little more than 40% of the population is bilingual, but that means that there's still 60% that is not, most of whom are French speakers, who therefore don't speak English very well at all and cannot function very well. Then you've New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and Ontario and so on and so forth. So notice that the degree or the percentage of bilingualism in Canada, despite an official policy which now dates to over 25 years, is in fact still relatively low.
هناك لغتان رسميتان في كندا، ولكن من المدهش أن نسبة من يتحدث لغتين أكثر من لا يزيد عن 40%، وفي كوبيك على سبيل المثال 60% لا يتحدثون اللغة الإنجليزية، وعلى الرغم من سياسة اللغتين لكن ما زال هناك من يتحدث لغة واحدة فقط.
Now the reason why this is important is because traditionally we have talked about Canada having two solitudes, the English side and the French side, and it plays into the dynamics and the political tensions. So developing pluralism in Canada had to find a solution to these kinds of tensions.
وسبب أهمية هذا الأمر أنه في كندا يوجد كيانان لهما أهميتهما في التعددية، فلا بد من النظر إلى هذه القضية.
Now, the allophone population is, as you can see, extremely high in Ontario, where you have the greatest percentage of the population. It's not very clear, right?
What is allophone?
Allophones. Oh, yes, of course, thank you. Allophones is those who speak a language other than English or French. Allophones, other than English or French. So it's the black little box at the bottom of the slide that the second slide before that. And so here, clearly the most diverse province is the one that has the largest population and the largest amount of immigration, Ontario, then British Columbia, and only third Quebec and Alberta. So, now, a little bit of information, statistics about the 2001 census. Today there's 10.3 million people, nearly half of Canada's population, age 15 and older, not including Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples, who report British, French, or Canadian ethnic origins, right? So that would be those of European background, especially if we add 4.3 million from other European origins. In other words, German, Dutch, Belgian, Ukrainian, Italian, Greek, all of those different older immigrant populations. Then we have to add basically almost 3 million reported non-European origins. And finally, very interestingly, 3.3 million reported mixed ethnicity. So a large degree of inter-ethnic marriages. To that, we need to add also 1 million Aboriginal people, or what we prefer to call at home Indigenous peoples. After all, it is the official United Nations language of Indigenous peoples. So it's about 1 million population, of which over half of them live now in urban cities. So we think often of Indigenous people living on the reservations, the traditional for lack of a better word, a form of ghettoization of Indigenous communities in different parcels of land in different parts of the country. But in fact, only about a quarter of Indigenous peoples live on the reservations now. Another quarter lives around those, not too far, but in small towns or cities not too far. And then over half of indigenous people live in the urban areas, making therefore, so in many ways in that level, immigrants and indigenous people also, and the traditional British French population, we all share in this urbanization phenomena of the 20th and now 21st century.
إحصائيات عام 2001 تذكر أن 10.3 من أصل أوروبي